Welcome to the still hour where history's worst decisions get the screen time they deserve. By 1870, Paraguay wasn't just defeated, it was on sale, clearance rack final season discontinued. 3 out of every 5 Paraguayans were gone. 9 out of 10 adult men. Also gone, entire family trees didn't just lose branches, they were uprooted, chopped into firewood and set on fire. The capital, Asunción, wasn't damaged. It was smoldering politely, like a city trying to pretend everything is fine while burning down in the background. And this wasn't a plague. It wasn't a natural disaster. This was human-made chaos courtesy of the War of the Triple Alliance, South America's deadliest group project, where Paraguay ended up doing all the dying. At the center of this catastrophe stood one man, Francisco Solano Lopez. Self-proclaimed genius, self-certified Napoleon of South America, and, spoiler, not actually Napoleon. So the big questions: how did one man's ambition vaporize an entire generation? Was Paraguay fighting for survival, or was Lopez basically speedrunning how to lose a country in 5 years? To figure this out, we rewind nearly half a century back to when South America was newly independent and full of hope. Hope that lasted approximately 5 minutes. Yes, independence brought freedom, but also tribal politics, petty rivalries, and border maps drawn by colonial interns who clearly didn't care. Argentina dreamed of being the new Spanish Empire 2.0. Brazil imagined itself as the region's final boss. Uruguay tried to be a country, but mostly ended up being a battlefield Airbnb for its neighbors. And Paraguay, landlocked, stubborn, and allergic to taking orders from anyone. Everyone suspected everyone else. Rivers turned into geopolitical chokeholds. Alliances formed, broke, reformed, then broke again, kind of like a messy high school relationship, but with cannons. Independence had been won, sure. Unity. Not so much. South America entered its new era not with peace, but with one giant looming question: who gets to be the regional alpha? Paraguay's fate hung on that question. Because when the war finally came, it wouldn't just test armies. It would test whether a nation could survive the decisions of a leader who thought he was Napoleon, but acted more like Napoleon after the exile. And as we'll see, Lopez, confident, dramatic, and dangerously committed to main character energy, would choose glory over caution every single time. A choice his people would pay for. In blood. When Spain's Rio de la Plata viceroyalty collapsed in the 1810s, 3 new nations popped out like freshly baked post-colonial muffins: Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. To the outside world, it looked like the region had finally unlocked the freedom achievement. Inside South America, it looked more like 3 siblings fighting over who inherited the family cow. Independence had delivered liberty, but unity absolutely not. Instead, it produced a collection of states that were highly independent, highly ambitious, and highly allergic to trusting each other. Argentina immediately appointed itself regional main character. Buenos Aires still glowing from its colonial glory. Days believed it was the natural leader of the neighborhood. In their minds, Uruguay, vice, a buffer state, Paraguay. An Argentine province going through a rebellious teenage phase, Paraguay disagreed. Loudly, fiercely landlocked and fiercely stubborn, it turned isolation into a lifestyle. Freedom from Spain was nice, but freedom from Argentina, that was the real prize. Meanwhile, Uruguay tried to enjoy being a small, peaceful coastal republic, and instead became a wrestling ring for 2 heavyweights. Argentina saw Montevideo as an extension of Buenos Aires' backyard. Brazil saw Uruguay as a strategic cushion it absolutely did not want Argentina to sit on. Uruguay was independent on paper, but in practice it was basically that friend stuck between 2 extremely dramatic exes. And then came the borders. Or well, the vague rumors of borders. Colonial cartographers had drawn lines after long lunches and questionable accuracy. Rivers shifted maps disagreed, and every stretch of pampas jungle and swamp seemed to belong to whoever showed up with more soldiers. Farmers paid taxes to whichever government stopped by first. It was basically paywall roulette. The worst tensions centered on the rivers. For Paraguay, the Paraná and Paraguay rivers were oxygen, its only way to reach the outside world. Argentina decided it owned the rivers. Brazil also decided it needed them. Paraguay decided both countries were being ridiculous. To Paraguay, these demands were insults. To Argentina and Brazil, Paraguay's pushback was insolence. Then, in 1844, Brazil made a bold diplomatic move. It recognized Paraguay's independence. Paraguay, finally. Someone sees me. Argentina. Excuse me, what do you think you're doing? To Buenos Aires, this was Brazil sticking its imperial nose where it absolutely did not belong. And so, 20 years after independence, the dream of unity had officially expired. Argentina wanted dominance. Brazil wanted expansion. Uruguay was trying not to get crushed. Paraguay was bristling at everyone like a very angry porcupine. The nations of the Rio de la Plata had been born free, but absolutely not born united. And soon all their competing ambitions, all their grudges, all their rivers, borders, and bruised egos would ignite a war that would make Paraguay bleed more than any nation in modern history. In 19th century South America, rivers were not just rivers. They were everything. Roads rare, railways, mostly theoretical. The interior, a beautiful maze of good luck getting through that. So if you wanted to trade travel or simply avoid starving, you needed water. Not drinking water, navigable rivers. And in the Rio de la Plata basin, 3 rivers were basically the region's holy trinity: the Paraná, the Paraguay, and the Uruguay. For Paraguay, these weren't just rivers. They were oxygen Wi-Fi, and the last lifeboat on the Titanic all at once. A landlocked nation surrounded by much bigger neighbors had exactly one route to the outside world: float everything downstream and pray Argentina behaved. Argentina did not behave. Buenos Aires declared that the Paraná River was theirs, like a cosmic DLC they owned exclusively, and that everyone using it should pay a fee. Paraguay, entirely unimpressed, called this what it was: economic chokehold, colonial edition. Every tax felt like Argentina saying, "Nice independence you have there. Shame if someone regulated it." Meanwhile, Brazil had its own river problems. Its distant province of Mato Grosso was so isolated that reaching it by land required months of heroic suffering. So Brazil relied on the Paraguay River, except Paraguay guarded that stretch, like a dragon protecting its hoard. Brazilian ships approaching Paraguay's waters often left with demands for paperwork. Abrupt turnback orders bruised national pride. To Asunción. This was simple: our river, our rules. To Brazil, it felt more like, why is this tiny country bullying us? Each denied ship sent tempers in Rio de Janeiro up another degree. Brazil was a 10-million-person empire. Paraguay had barely 500,000. The imbalance made every confrontation sting twice as much. But don't mistake this for mere economics. This was ego territory rivers as veins of national pride. Paraguay, blocking passage, said, "We're not your pawn." Argentina and Brazil heard, are they seriously doing this? Everyday people felt the tension too. Ranchers didn't know which country would tax them today. Merchant caravans prayed for the correct flag to appear around the river bend. Fishermen watched gunboats drift by and thought, well, that can't be good. Rumors of war flowed downstream faster than actual cargo. Meanwhile, the maps were a mess. Politicians in 3 capitals kept redrawing borders like competitive toddlers, each insisting the rivers belonged entirely to them. Out in the marshes, the real rule was simpler: whoever had the gunboat enforced their version of geography. These rivers carried wealth, life, and trade, but also jealousy, resentment, and ambition. All they needed was a spark, and South America's waterways would soon run red. Uruguay may be tiny on a map, but in 19th century South America, it was basically the router of the entire region. Its capital, Montevideo, sat right at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, the front door to the Paraná and Paraguay rivers. Control Uruguay, and you control the Wi-Fi password for all inland trade. Naturally, Argentina and Brazil both wanted that password. Inside Uruguay, politics were dramatic. On one side stood the Colorados based in Montevideo, and supported by merchants, immigrants, and elites, basically everybody who liked international trade and wearing shoes. They leaned toward Brazil and Argentina. On the other side lurked the Blancos anchored in the countryside, fueled by ranchers, rural landowners, and people who thought Paraguay made a great best friend. This wasn't just politics. It was cultural, social, borderline tribal. To each side, the other wasn't the opposition. They were the people ruining the country on purpose. Civil war became Uruguay's unofficial national hobby. Armed groups roamed the countryside, torching ranches, ambushing convoys, and leaving corpses as passive-aggressive yard decor. Farmers plowed fields under the nervous stare of militias. Brazil had already intervened twice in the 1850s to support the Colorados. Each intervention only made tensions worse, while Paraguay watched from the sidelines like a very nervous neighbor keeping binoculars on the HOA committee. For Lopez, a Blanco-led Uruguay wasn't just nice to have, it was priceless. It was Paraguay's only friendly exit to the Atlantic, the last window that hadn't been bricked shut by Brazil or Argentina. Then came 1863. The fragile peace cracked like cheap pottery. The Colorados rebelled, the Blancos fought back, and Uruguay once again turned into a live-action smoke machine. Brazil, tired of dealing with a government that wasn't a fan of Brazilian interests, finally snapped. In 1864, it issued an ultimatum: protect Brazilian citizens, or we'll come do it for you. The Blancos, proud and allergic to intimidation, said no. Brazil responded with gunboats, which is diplomacy with extra steps. In October, Brazilian warships bombarded the coast, instantly deleting Uruguay's tiny navy from existence. Brazilian troops marched across the border heading for Montevideo, with full confidence this would be quick, clean, and convenient. But in Asunción, Lopez was watching this like someone seeing their last lifeline being set on fire. Uruguay wasn't just an ally, it was Paraguay's only ally, the final friendly face in a neighborhood of giants. If the Blancos fell, Paraguay would be surrounded like a lost snack in the middle of an ant colony. To Lopez, Brazil's invasion wasn't regional politics. It was a threat to Paraguay's survival, full stop. And if there was one thing Lopez loved more than military uniforms, it was dramatic reactions. So he made a decision: Paraguay wouldn't wait to be trapped. It would strike first. By October 1864, Brazil had decided it was done asking politely. Imperial warships rolled up to Uruguay's coast cannons blazing and erased the Blanco Navy, a navy so tiny that Brazil basically committed a war crime against a fishing club. Meanwhile, on land, Brazilian troops crossed the border with the confidence of people who had already written mission accomplished in their diaries. Uruguay, in their eyes, was finished. The Colorados would be restored, and Brazil's influence would shine brightly once again. A quick intervention, clean, efficient, nothing dramatic. But Francisco Solano Lopez did not do nothing dramatic. Where Brazil saw a minor operation, Lopez saw a giant imperial sword hovering over Paraguay's neck. Argentina hated him to the west. Brazil towered over him to the north. Now Uruguay, his only friend, was about to become Brazil's loyal sidekick. To Lopez, this wasn't geopolitics. It was a horror movie where the walls slowly close in. So he reacted the way every totally calm, totally rational leader reacts. He hijacked a Brazilian steamer. On November 13, 1864, Paraguayan Marines stormed the Brazilian ship Marquês de Olinda as it approached Asunción. They captured the crew, seized the cargo, and basically announced to the entire continent, "Hi, Brazil, we'd like to unsubscribe from your intimidation newsletter." A month later, Lopez made it official. On December 13th, Paraguay declared war on Brazil, and that, dear viewer, is what historians call a choice. Because Paraguay had population 500,000, army 70,000, but many barefoot carrying antique muskets and missing boots uniforms or both. And Brazil had population 10 million. A navy, big, modern, terrifying allies, lurking in the shadows, waiting to join shoes plenty. But Lopez, he believed in discipline, speed, destiny, and the power of cosplay-level Napoleon admiration. If he moved fast enough, he thought Brazil wouldn't have time to assemble its massive resources. In Asunción, the declaration of war landed like fireworks. Crowds cheered, bands played, and people marched proudly through the streets. For a small nation constantly dismissed as that landlocked place between the big guys, it was intoxicating to stand up to an empire. But Brazil was only chapter 1. Lopez's ambition and his temper were about to drag yet another neighbor into the abyss. Lopez had declared war, and now came the part where he actually had to win it, always, the inconvenient step in any ambitious plan. His strategy was simple, elegant, and slightly delusional: hit Brazil first. Hit Brazil fast. Hit Brazil so hard it forgets it's 10 times bigger. The target, Mato Grosso, Brazil's remote frontier province famous for jungle swamps and being strategically important only to people who had never visited it. In December 1864, Paraguayan columns marched north like they'd been told victory was waiting just around the next tree. Barefoot soldiers waded through mud, hacked through wilderness, and still managed to overwhelm isolated Brazilian outposts. They burned villages, cut telegraph lines, and sent settlers fleeing in panic. For a brief, glorious moment, Paraguay looked unstoppable, a tiny underdog body-slamming a giant. Asunción celebrated like it was carnival. Newspapers declared Lopez a military genius. The people believed Brazil was finally being taught a lesson: don't mess with the landlocked kid. But reality soon tapped Lopez on the shoulder. Mato Grosso was enormous empty, and to Brazil about as important as losing a sock. Embarrassing, sure, catastrophic, not at all. And the deeper Paraguay marched, the worse things got. Supplies vanished. Disease marched faster than soldiers. The jungle, offended by their presence, started eating men alive. Worst of all, Brazil's navy. Ironclads and gunboats patrolled the rivers, like aquatic bullies cutting Paraguay off from reinforcements and supplies. Lopez may have had an army, but Brazil had the waterways, the real highways of South America. And without those rivers, every Paraguayan victory was basically an expensive camping trip. Still, Lopez pushed on. Speed, he believed, was his magic weapon. If Paraguay could now strike south and link up with Uruguay's embattled Blancos, the war might turn in his favor. There was just one tiny obstacle: Argentina. To reach Uruguay, Lopez needed to march through the province of Corrientes, so he did the polite thing: he sent envoys to Buenos Aires requesting passage. Paraguay wasn't here to meddle, he promised. Just a casual army stroll through their backyard. Argentina's response: laughter, a firm no, and probably a door slam for dramatic effect. For Lopez, the refusal was not diplomacy. It was an insult. He had asked nicely and been mocked, and so naturally he escalated. If Argentina wouldn't allow passage, Paraguay would take the passage. With that decision, the fire spread. The war was no longer Paraguay versus Brazil. It was about to engulf the entire Rio de la Plata. To understand the war of the Triple Alliance, you have to understand the man at the center of the chaos, Paraguay's president-general national mascot, and eventual national tragedy, Francisco Solano Lopez. This wasn't just a leader. This was a one-man government starter pack. Born in 1827 as the son of Paraguay's first president, Lopez grew up knowing exactly what he was meant to be: in charge of something. Anything, preferably everything. But then came the trip that changed his life. He visited Europe, and Paris did what Paris always does. It filled him with romantic ideas and an unhealthy admiration for men in fancy hats. He studied military science. He marched in parades. He got front-row seats to Napoleon III's imperial cosplay. But it wasn't Napoleon III who stole his heart. It was the other Napoleon. The original, the legend, the man who made Europe collectively ask, "Is that artillery?" I hear Lopez saw Napoleon Bonaparte and thought, yes, that is the energy I will be bringing home. And bring it home he did. When he returned to Paraguay, he didn't just bring a suitcase. He brought an obsession, a vision, and what can only be described as a life-size Napoleon complex. He transformed Paraguay into something between a heavily armed beehive and a full-time boot camp. Forts went up. Foundries smoked day and night. Fields that once grew exports were now producing soldiers like they were going out of style. By 1862, when Lopez took office, Paraguay, with a population of barely 500,000, had assembled an army of 70,000 men, the largest standing force in South America. Impressive, right? Well, yes, if you ignored the small details. Many soldiers marched barefoot. Some carried muskets older than their grandparents, and others trained with wooden rifles, which is adorable until bullets enter the picture. Paraguay had discipline, heart, and national pride. What it didn't have was, actual equipment. Still, Lopez saw himself not just as a president, but as a prophet of Paraguayan greatness, commander, visionary savior man, whose hat was one plume away from summoning the spirit of Napoleon. Officers didn't just follow him, they pledged personal loyalty. He rode through parades in full regalia, looking like a man who had opened a costume chest and said, yes. All of it. To admirers, he was the hero Paraguay needed. To critics, he was the South American embodiment of I can fix it energy, without the ability to actually fix anything. The truth, he was both. Brilliant and reckless. Inspirational and delusional. A leader capable of rallying miracles or manufacturing disasters. And as the war widened, his obsession with destiny grew louder than reason. He believed history had given him only two choices: win like Napoleon, or die like Napoleon. He would accept either as long as it came with a legend. But legends aren't paid for in speeches. They're paid for in blood. And soon Lopez would spend it in torrents. In April 1865, Francisco Solano Lopez decided it was time to stop asking Argentina for permission and start asking for forgiveness, the military kind. Argentina had refused to let Paraguay march through its territory. Lopez, offended on a spiritual level, responded the way only a man with a Napoleon complex could. He marched in anyway. He ordered 20,000 men to cross into the province of Corrientes. The Paraguayan army swept in with drums pounding, flags flying, and bayonets gleaming like they were filming a trailer for Paraguay the musical. Within days, they captured the provincial capital and seized Argentine warships sitting in the harbor like ducks waiting politely to be kidnapped. In Asunción, the reaction was euphoric. Bells rang, crowds cheered. Newspapers printed headlines like Paraguay had just won the World Cup, the lottery, and divine blessing all at once. Lopez was now hailed as the protector of Uruguay, the avenger of South American liberty, and the guy who just embarrassed Argentina before breakfast. Paraguay felt invincible, small, defiant, and apparently capable of kicking its neighbors in the shins hard enough to knock them over. But reality had other plans. By invading Corrientes, Lopez unintentionally pressed the giant red "Unite Your Enemies" button. Argentina, normally busy arguing with itself, suddenly discovered the magical power of national unity. President Bartolomé Mitre declared Paraguay an invader, a menace, a threat that must be crushed. Recruitment offices overflowed with volunteers fueled by outrage and probably a lot of yelling. Even worse, Lopez's invasion pulled Brazil and Argentina into each other's arms. These two had spent decades side-eyeing one another like rival telenovela villains. Now, thanks to Lopez, they were holding hands. And Uruguay. Oh, Uruguay was done pretending to be neutral. The Blancos were collapsing, the Colorados were backed by Brazilian bayonets, and suddenly Uruguay happily slid into the anti-Paraguay team like it was joining a group chat. In less than 12 months, Lopez had achieved the impossible. He turned a defensive war into a continental one. Instead of isolating Brazil, he isolated himself. And he managed to summon the Triple Alliance: Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, united against Paraguay. Napoleon would have been impressed, and also horrified. But Lopez didn't see a doom spiral, he saw destiny. He convinced himself that bold moves plus fast strikes was Sears' victory. If he just hit hard enough and often enough, surely the alliance would crumble. This was optimistic. The kind of optimism only found in inspirational posters and leaders with dangerously high self-confidence. But fantasies die hard, especially when you have an entire army carrying them for you. So Lopez marched on, convinced history was just waiting for him to grab it. What he had really grabbed was the beginning of Paraguay's downfall. On May 1st, 1865, 3 delegations gathered in Buenos Aires to sign a document so ruthless it might as well have started with Step 1, destroy Paraguay. Brazil, Argentina, and the newly Brazil-approved Colorado regime of Uruguay joined forces to create the Triple Alliance TM, now with extra vengeance. And their mission statement wasn't subtle. They weren't just aiming to defeat Paraguay's army. Oh no. Their goals were overthrow Francisco Solano, Lopez dismantle his government, take back every inch of captured territory, charge Paraguay war reparations it could never pay, and basically put a "please don't ever start a war again" sign on the country. This wasn't a defensive pact. This was a demolition plan. For Lopez, the news hit like an existential slap. His invasion of Corrientes, meant to isolate Brazil, had instead performed the diplomatic equivalent of gluing Brazil and Argentina together. His bold move to save Uruguay's Blancos had ended with the Blancos gone entirely. Beautiful. Paraguay was now alone, outnumbered 20-1, and friendless. But retreat, negotiate. Admit he miscalculated, please. Lopez was physically incapable of such things. Instead, he doubled down the Lopez default setting. Across Paraguay, church bells rang out like the national ringtone for, well, we're doing this now. Mobilization was total. Every able-bodied man drafted. Women sewing uniforms, hauling supplies, and keeping the country functioning. Children drilling with wooden rifles, fully expecting to trade up to real ones soon. Paraguay became a giant military camp with slightly more cows. Lopez framed the war not as my decisions have consequences, but as a heroic battle for national survival. He declared patria o muerte, the homeland, or death. Everyone ignored the fact that he was making death feel unusually likely, and the people believed him. Patriotism surged. Packed ranks sang hymns, marched proudly, and genuinely felt they could stand against three empires. It was no longer Lopez's war. It was Paraguay's war. But math still exists. The Allies had modern navies, massive populations, industrial economies, and more resources than Paraguay could dream of. Paraguay had enthusiasm and, well, enthusiasm. But Lopez remained convinced that if he struck quickly enough, he could break the alliance before it crushed him. He believed victory was still possible, because when your role model is Napoleon, denial is part of the personality package. And so the war shifted toward its next phase, the struggle for control of the rivers. The largest naval battle in South American history was about to begin. Spoiler boats will explode. June 11, 1865. The rivers of South America woke up and chose violence. At the riverside town of Riachuelo, Paraguay, decided it was time for a bold cinematic, this will definitely work kind of plan. Lopez ordered Admiral Pedro Ignacio Meza to sneak up on the Brazilian fleet at dawn, hop aboard their ships like river ninjas and, well, murder everyone. It was supposed to be Paraguay's big surprise moment, but unfortunately Admiral Meza was not built for stealth gameplay. As the Paraguayan flotilla glided forward in silence, Meza panicked, pressed the wrong historical button, and opened fire way too early. Boom. There went the element of surprise, and with it, Paraguay's best chance at not losing its entire navy. The Brazilians who had been relaxing on shore, enjoying there, were definitely safe. Morning sprinted back onto their ships. Chaos briefly reigned. But Brazilian chaos has a short lifespan, because in the middle of it stood Admiral Francisco Manuel Barroso, a man who woke up that morning and said, "I'm going to ram someone today," commanding the paddle steamer Amazonas. Barroso pushed the throttle aimed straight at the Paraguayan line and turned his warship into a floating battering ram. He smashed through vessels, flipped barges, and scattered sailors like bowling pins. The river quickly transformed into a scene that can only be described as historical carnage. Fog rolled in. Cannon fire echoed in every direction. Ships fired blindly. Some Paraguayan boats zipped around like angry mosquitoes. Brazilian ironclads lumbered forward like steel dinosaurs. For a few moments it even looked like Paraguay might pull off the impossible. Then Admiral Meza, the one man holding the navy together, was hit in the chest and killed. With him went discipline, hope, and the last shreds of naval organization. The Paraguayan fleet broke, then retreated, then disintegrated. By noon it was over. Paraguay's navy gone. Brazil completely in control of the rivers. And this mattered because in South America, rivers aren't just wet geography. They're supply lines, access routes, and in Paraguay's case, the only hallway to the outside world. Now, Brazil controlled all of it. In Asunción, the news landed like a thunderclap. Lopez had promised great naval glory. Instead, he delivered fleet destroyed before lunchtime. People still cheered him in public because cheering was safer than not cheering. But doubt quietly started seeping in like water into a sinking ship. For Paraguay's army, the defeat was worse than humiliating. It meant no naval support, no secure supply routes, no backup, and every retreat shadowed by Brazilian gunboats. Riachuelo wasn't just a defeat. It was the defeat, the turning point. Paraguay would never again control the rivers, and without the rivers, victory was basically a myth. But Lopez Hay looked at this catastrophe and said, minor setback. Like Napoleon after Moscow, he convinced himself that one more bold stroke would save everything. And so naturally he turned his gaze toward Uruguay once again. Because why retreat when you can double down? After the naval disaster at Riachuelo, most leaders would have paused, reflected, maybe reconsidered life choices. Francisco Solano López Nope. He doubled down like a man who really didn't understand the concept of warning signs. He still clung to his dream of rescuing Uruguay's Blancos, the only political faction on the continent that didn't immediately want him dead. If he could just reach them, surely everything would magically fix itself. There was only one problem. Brazil now controlled every river Paraguay needed. March by river. A guaranteed disaster. March by land. Also a guaranteed disaster, just dustier. But Lopez was a man of consistency, so he chose the option that made him look the boldest on paper. In late 1865, he sent 3,000 Paraguayan soldiers south to cross the Uruguay River. Picture them, barefoot uniforms held together by hope and questionable stitching rifles older than their grandparents' morale powered almost entirely by patriotic yelling. Their mission: reach the Blancos before Brazil and Argentina slammed the door shut. Spoiler, the door slammed. At Jataí, 9,000 Allied troops, Brazilians, Argentines, and Colorado Uruguayans stood waiting. The Paraguayans were outnumbered 3-1, but they charged anyway because if there's one thing Paraguayan soldiers specialized in, it was heroic decisions with terrible survival odds. For a moment, they shocked everyone. Paraguayan cavalry smashed into Argentine infantry like a historical jump scare. Then reality returned. Allied artillery opened up. Infantry squares formed hedgehogs of bayonets. The riverbank turned into a blender of mud blood and shattered hopes. Men fell into the Uruguay River, thrashing desperately before sinking beneath the current. By the end, it wasn't a battle. It was an erasure. All 3,000 Paraguayans killed or captured. A devastating blow for a nation with a population roughly the size of a small modern city. In Paraguay, the news hit like a hammer. Families wept. Women whispered about a war that consumed every household one son at a time. But Lopez, ever the optimist in the worst possible way, he insisted, "Totally necessary. We're on the brink of greatness." Meanwhile, supplies dwindled, ammunition ran low. Disease seeped into every camp, soldiers wrapped feet in rags. Men marched hungry, wounded comrades were hauled on scraps of wood. The Paraguayan army still obeyed, but loyalty was fading fast, and yet their bravery remained undeniable. At Jataí, they fought like men determined to make history remember them, and history did. But bravery isn't a currency you can trade for victory. Lopez's Uruguay fantasy was dead. The Blancos were crushed. The Colorados, backed by Brazil, sat comfortably in power. The Triple Alliance was fully united. And worst of all, they were marching north. Into Paraguay. Into the heart of Lopez's crumbling kingdom. May 24th, 1866. Welcome to Tuyuti, a quiet, marshy spot near the Paraná River that was about to become South America's unofficial audition for Worst Day to be a Paraguayan soldier. Francisco Solano Lopez, frustrated that reality kept rudely contradicting his plans, decided there was only one logical solution. Go big. Ridiculously big. So he gathered 27,000 men, the largest army Paraguay would ever put into the field, and aimed them straight at the Allied camp. The plan was simple: smash Brazil, smash Argentina, smash Uruguay. Hope the Triple Alliance would look at each other, panic, and go home. You know, a perfectly normal plan for a country with 500,000 people. At dawn, the Paraguayan army marched forward, bayonets shining, lances, gleaming, drums pounding like the world's angriest marching band. And, incredibly, it worked. At first, the Allies were caught completely off guard, men stumbling out of tents, tripping over boots, trying to figure out why thousands of Paraguayan soldiers were suddenly screaming very enthusiastically toward them. Panic rippled through the Allied camp. For about 5 minutes. Then the artillery woke up. Argentine and Brazilian cannons began roaring like they'd had 3 cups of espresso and a personal grudge. Grapeshot tore through Paraguayan ranks. The marsh slowed the attackers, breaking the assault into messy, doomed waves. Still, the Paraguayans kept coming. Hour after hour. A human tide of determination and desperation. When they ran out of ammunition, they charged with bayonets. When those broke, they charged anyway. By evening, 13,000 Paraguayans were dead or dying, nearly half the attacking force. For a nation of 500,000 people, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was generational devastation. Whole regiments vanished. Entire villages lost all their sons in a single day. The Allies also suffered around 3,000 dead, but Brazil and Argentina could replace their losses. Paraguay could not. And yet, Lopez declared victory. He told his people that Paraguay had terrified its enemies, and destiny was still on their side. Reality disagreed. Tuyuti was not a heroic turning point. It was the beginning of the slow bleed. But Lopez, he wasn't done. Because if there's one thing the self-styled Napoleon of South America believed in, it was one more glorious gamble. And Paraguay would keep paying the bill. After the meat grinder of Tuyuti, both armies did what any sensible human beings would do. They stopped, stared at the carnage, and reconsidered all their life choices. But reconsidering did not mean stopping the war. Oh no. Instead, South America's largest conflict shifted into its least glamorous phase, the Great Eternal Soul-Crushing Mud Period. The borderlands turned into a vast network of trenches, and by trenches we mean muddy ditches, that smelled like a mixture of swamp water death and someone's terrible idea of a latrine. Soldiers now lived knee-deep in mud, chest-deep in misery, and head-deep in diseases with names ending in era mosquitoes, attacked with more enthusiasm than cavalry. Water was basically poison. Dysentery, cholera, and fever were on killing streaks that would make artillery jealous. Corpses were buried shallowly, meaning the battlefield came with built-in air freshener set permanently to horror. Even the Allies were suffering. Brazil started conscripting slaves from plantations and shipping them straight to the front, where cannonballs and disease politely welcomed them. Argentina dragged provincial peasants into the mud after giving them about 12 minutes of training. Uruguay, already half exhausted from its own civil wars, could barely scrape together enough troops to form a marching band. Desertion soared. Morale tanked. Commanders argued about strategy, which was impressive, considering none of them had a good one. Paraguay, not better. Actually, worse. Lopez had reached that point of the war where he was scraping the bottom of the human barrel. Boys barely in their teens were handed rifles heavier than they were. Elderly men who should have been enjoying retirement were marched back into battle. Women kept the nation alive, sewing uniforms, growing food, carrying supplies, and taking care of the wounded. Basically, they were doing everything, except being responsible for the war, which was 100% on one man. Entire families were now part of the war machine, willingly or not. In this miserable stalemate, Lopez tried something radical: diplomacy. He sent envoys to Argentine President Bartolomé Mitre offering negotiations. Lopez was ready to compromise, give up some territory. Sure, return captured ships. Okay. Sovereignty intact, non-negotiable. Mitre responded with the diplomatic equivalent of flipping the table. No compromise, no negotiation, no Lopez, no Paraguay, unless it came pre-defeated. To Mitre, the goal wasn't peace. It was ensuring Paraguay never rose again. For Lopez, this was humiliating, but also clarifying. The Allies didn't want to talk. They wanted him gone. So he chose defiance. He told Paraguay's soldiers the homeland was sacred. He told civilians that survival itself was victory. He told everyone that resistance was their destiny, preferably to the last breath. And so the war slogged on trenches, rotting soldiers, wasting away hope, dissolving like wet gunpowder. Yet somehow Lopez's pride remained perfectly intact. And because pride has a terrible sense of timing, Lopez decided the solution was obvious. Just fight another giant battle. What could go wrong this time? Thus in September 1866, he ordered his army to take their positions at Curupayty, a stronghold by the river. The Allies were coming, and they were about to learn a very painful lesson. September 22nd, 1866. The Allies had reached that stage of the war where their strategy could be summarized as, what if we just shoot at it harder? Their new target, Curupayty, Paraguay's river fortress, swamp fortress, mud fortress, and please do not attack us from the front fortress. The Allied plan was simple. In fact, it was so simple it bordered on adorable Blast Curupati with one of the largest naval bombardments South America had ever seen. Assume everything inside was now ash. Walk in, collect victory. What could possibly go wrong? At dawn, Brazilian ironclads opened fire. For hours, the river sounded like an angry god playing drums with explosives. Shells arced. Mud flew. Timber disintegrated. Allied commanders nodded proudly as if they had personally invented explosions. Then came the infantry. Drums rolling bugles singing the whole parade marching into hell aesthetic. And then came the surprise. Turns out the Paraguayan defenders weren't ash. They weren't rubble. They weren't even mildly singed. They were very much alive, very well hidden, and very ready. As the Allied troops waded through swampy muck, Paraguayan guns erupted at point-blank range, including the surprise artillery the bombardment hadn't touched. Grape shot sliced through the ranks. Columns collapsed. Soldiers fell into pools of red water. Officers tried to shout orders, but the only consistent order was, try not to drown or get shot, good luck. The marsh, meanwhile, behaved like Paraguay's unofficial Fourth Army. It slowed the attackers, packed them tightly, and funneled them perfectly into the killing zones the defenders had designed. It wasn't a battle. It became a blender. By nightfall, Curupati had delivered one of the most lopsided outcomes in South American military history. Allied casualties, nearly 4,000 Paraguayan casualties, fewer than 100. Even the battlefield seemed stunned. Survivors limped back to camp in silent horror uniforms, soaked boots, ruined morale somewhere beneath the mud. In Asunción, bells rang with joy, crowds cried tears of relief. For once, Paraguay hadn't just resisted, it had absolutely obliterated a major Allied assault. Lopez naturally declared it a sign from heaven. Curupati was divine justice destiny, possibly a cosmic thumbs up. And for a brief, shining moment, Paraguay believed him. But the triumph was deceptive. Brazil could replace 4,000 men before breakfast. Argentina and Uruguay could refill their ranks soon enough. The alliance might be embarrassed, but embarrassment doesn't kill armies. Paraguay, however, food running out fields, barren troops, exhausted population stretched to the limit. The victory was heroic, but strategically disastrous. Curupati bought time, not salvation. And time was the one thing Paraguay had the least of. The Allies regrouped. New leaders stepped in. A new plan formed. And now the war's center of gravity shifted to one name, whispered with dread, Humata, the Gibraltar of South America. After the humiliation at Curupati, the Allied armies looked like they had been collectively hit by a bus made of cholera malaria and bad leadership. Desertion rose, morale fell, and even the mosquitoes seemed to be reconsidering their life choices. But Brazil had something Paraguay absolutely did not. A government willing to throw infinite money and infinite soldiers at the problem. And in late 1866, they found the perfect man to conduct this infinite strategy. Marshal Luis Alves de Lima y Silva, the Duke of Caxias. If Lopez was South America's self-proclaimed Napoleon, then Caxias was, well, the exact opposite. No theatrics, no grand speeches, no fancy hats. Just calm, methodical, slow-burn destruction. Think of him as the military equivalent of a man who quietly organizes his entire garage and then invades you with perfect efficiency. His mission was simple: strangle Paraguay. Slowly, completely, preferably without unnecessary drama. And at the heart of this mission stood the legendary Paraguayan fortress, Humaitá, the Gibraltar of South America. A colossal stronghold perched on the Paraguay River. Cannons everywhere. Earthworks deep enough to hide your problems in. A massive chain across the river. Yes, Paraguay literally installed a metal "Do Not Enter" sign for Brazilian ships. For years, Paraguay bragged about Humaitá like it was a national superhero, impregnable, unbreakable. Not even the devil can pass, as long as Humaitá held, Asunción was untouchable. Caxias was not impressed. He began the siege with the slow, steady patience of a man assembling IKEA furniture without instructions. For 8 months, he trained his army. He rebuilt supply lines. He forced sanitation reforms the Brazilian army had issues. And he had engineers carve roads through swamps that looked like they were designed by a committee of angry crocodiles. Every week the Allied lines crept closer. Every month the noose tightened. Then came the moment Lopez had prayed would never arrive. In February 1868, Brazilian ironclads launched one of the boldest naval stunts of the century. They charged straight at Humaita's river chain under a hurricane of Paraguayan fire. Cannons roared. Shells splashed. Decks ran red. Commanders screamed things no historian has dared to record. And yet, the ships broke through. Humaita, the fortress, built specifically to prevent that exact scenario, had just been flanked. From that moment its fate was sealed. Surrounded on land. Passed on the river. Starved from the inside. The defenders held out for months, fighting with a desperation only a dying nation can muster. But in July 1868, the inevitable happened. Humaita fell. Paraguay's Gibraltar gone. Its greatest stronghold gone. Its shield shattered. Lopez ran north, insisting everything was fine. When a leader flees deeper into the jungle, it is rarely a sign that things are fine. For Paraguayan families, the fall of Humaita wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment hope itself cracked. Still, Lopez refused to accept reality. Like Napoleon muttering motivational speeches in the snow outside Moscow, he promised new victories, new destinies, new miracles. But reality didn't care. With Humaita gone, the path to Asunción lay wide open, and the Allies were already marching toward the capital. With Humaita gone, the road to Paraguay's capital lay as wide open as a supermarket at 3 a.m. The Allies could practically see Asunción glowing on the horizon like a "Please invade me" sign. And yet, Francisco Solano Lopez, South America's most stubborn man since the invention of machetes, refused to accept defeat. He ordered new trenches, new earthworks, and new layers of no-entry signs along the Piquisiri River. If Humaita was the Gibraltar of South America, then Piquisiri was, well, more like a muddy speed bump. But Lopez didn't care. He swore Paraguay would fight for every swamp, every mosquito nest, every miserable patch of jungle. Enter the Duke of Caxias again. Caxias looked at Lopez's new fortifications, stroked his metaphorical beard, and concluded, no thanks. He wasn't going to charge straight into those defenses, not when he could outsmart them instead. So Caxias unveiled his master plan. Build a secret road through the jungle. Not a nice road. Not a paved road. Not even a road in the traditional sense. More like a 10-kilometer DIY jungle tunnel hacked out by thousands of increasingly miserable soldiers swinging machetes and cursing every tree in South America. Meanwhile, Paraguayan sentries sat patiently in their trenches, waiting for an attack that never came, probably wondering if the Allies had decided to go home or gotten lost. Then came December 1868. Surprise. The Allied army suddenly burst out of the jungle behind the Paraguayan lines. Q screaming, confusion, general chaos. Several soldiers asking how did they get there. Lopez's entire defensive line collapsed like a wet sandcastle. This marked the beginning of the Piquisiri campaign, a string of battles best described as Paraguay running north at top speed, while the Allies chased them with infinite supplies. The final stand, Lomas Valentinas. Here, Lopez personally commanded what was left of his army half-starved, mostly barefoot, some armed with pikes. Yes, actual medieval pikes, against modern guns. In 1868. Because why not? Still, they fought with astonishing bravery, waves of Paraguayans throwing themselves at Allied positions in a last desperate show of defiance. Superior firepower did the rest. By the end of the battle, Paraguay's last organized army ceased to exist. Lopez escaped by clinging to a wild cavalry charge like he was in an action movie. Most of his generals were captured. His command structure disintegrated completely. January 1st, 1869. The Allies entered Asunción. But if they expected a grand capital full of riches and cheering crowds, they were deeply disappointed. They found a nearly empty city. Many homes abandoned, churches looted, neighborhoods burned. Very little worth capturing. Years of war had drained Asuncion into a ghost town. Still symbolically, this was the moment. Paraguay's capital had fallen. Its government was scattered. Its armies were gone. For any rational leader, the war would be over. But Francisco Solano Lopez was not a rational leader. He was a myth in his own mind, a man who believed surrender was worse than extinction. So he fled into the interior, declaring, "We fight on," even if the country didn't have soldiers, or food, or ammunition, or shoes, or a functioning economy, or a capital. And thus began the war's final, most tragic act, a nation forced into guerrilla war, by the one man still refusing to let it die. By 1869, Paraguay wasn't just losing the war. Paraguay was the war. The capital was gone. The army was dust. The population was starving. Honestly, the only thing still standing was Francisco Solano Lopez's ego, and even that had scorch marks. Any normal leader at this point would have said, "Okay, you know what? Enough, you win, please stop." But Lopez wasn't normal. He was Paraguay's self-appointed Napoleon, except this version was running on jungle roots, patriotic speeches, and sheer delusion. To him, surrender, dishonor. Defeat, death. Negotiations, a word that does not exist in Guarani. It does, but don't tell him that. Paraguay becomes an army made of everyone. With no real army left, Lopez retreated into the countryside and began recruiting. Teenage boys whose uniforms looked like they'd borrowed their dad's coat. Old men who should have been arguing about fishing, not carrying muskets. Women carrying supplies, patching clothes, and sometimes grabbing weapons themselves. Paraguay didn't have soldiers anymore. Paraguay was soldiers, every family, every village, every last breathing human being. And to ensure the Allies never captured anything useful, Lopez adopted the strategy of burning everything. Villages burned, fields torched, crops destroyed. Congratulations, Paraguay, you're now fighting the Allies, and hunger and mosquitoes. Desperation turns inward. Naturally, people began trying to desert. Lopez responded with exactly the kind of empathy and compassion you'd expect shoot deserters. Civilians suspected of doubting him also shot. At this stage, Paraguay wasn't fighting Brazil anymore. It was fighting the gravitational pull of Lopez's pride. Meanwhile, the Allies are in jungle hell. Brazilian, Argentine, and Uruguayan soldiers chased Lopez through terrain so miserable it should have come with a warning label. The jungle delivered fevers, ambushes, disappearing trails, and a general sense of, why did we ever leave Rio, Montevideo, Buenos Aires? But every battle brought them closer. Lopez's once mighty 70,000-man army had shrunk to a ghost force. A few thousand, then a few hundred. Then, the end. Cerro Cora, March 1st, 1870. A remote valley, a river. 400 starving Paraguayans, barefoot, exhausted, many armed with pikes because of course they were. Facing them 4,000 Brazilian veterans, well-fed, well-armed, and very ready to go home. The battle lasted minutes. Paraguayan defenders fought with heartbreaking courage, but courage doesn't stop bullets. Lopez, wounded and surrounded, refused to surrender. A cavalryman's lance struck him. A bullet finished the job. And in true dramatic fashion, because of course he did, Lopez spat out his final line, "Muero con mi patria, I die with my nation." Then he fell. The war was over. But the cost was something no nation should ever have to pay.